Well, hello, this is Vincent Green, and we're going to continue our look at Foundations of Exposition. And this is video number 4 in a 6-part series in regards to illustrations or illustrations of persuasive exposition. And we've been looking at the speeches of Paul that are recorded in the book of Acts. And so it's important to examine these speeches because it gives you, again, a picture. It gives you a visual expression of what we would talk about in terms of theoretical, in terms of the being persuasive in speaking. I've described the nature of it and described the need for it, but it's hard to grasp unless you see someone do this. And I could show you current modern day preachers who are passionate in their preaching. They show conviction, but I wanted to stick with Scripture. I wanted you to see some biblical examples of this or biblical illustrations of this, even though we don't have a video of these speeches being presented. And I mean, Jesus preached, Stephen preached, and we have Peter's sermons, but I wanted to stick with one character if possible, and Paul the Apostle was definitely a preacher of the gospel, a preacher of God's word. And so as we've been working through these speeches, my purpose has not been to give you a detailed exegetical analysis of the text. If I was going through the book of Acts, verse by verse, I would give you that treatment. But my purpose has been to kind of give you a perspective, to help you to see what's going on here, to help you to see what's happening here in terms of what Paul is saying. And so anyway, the one we're looking at now is still Paul in Caesarea. Eventually, Paul would go to Rome. But the next two speeches, speech number 4, which is Acts 25, chapter 25, verses 1 to 12. And then the next one is the most lengthiest one, starting in the middle of chapter 25, going all the way through chapter 26. When you see this, you have to realize that that Paul is still in Caesarea, even though one of the characters has changed, and that is Felix is no longer the Roman governor over Judea. Now someone else is in charge, and his name is Festus. And Porcius Festus, or Porcius Festus is his name. And based on my little chart that I found online, Felix kind of ruled over the land from AD 52 to 60. He was the Roman procurator. Not sure how to fully pronounce that, sorry. But he was there for about 8 years. And Festus, though, was only there for 2 years. So after Festus, there was a guy named Albinus, and then Florus and Julianus. And so again, it's as time went on. So it was that period of time. And knowing those dates, see, the Romans would date things. And knowing those dates helps us put things together in terms of when biblical events took place. And so it connects all the dots for us in that way. So we're looking at the time frame of 60 to 62, AD 60 to 62, when and Festus, this would be at the beginning of that. So we were looking more at AD 60 because the way the text reads, he had just taken over. And so Porcius Festus was now the new governor of the area of Judea. Remember, you can look at the notes along with me. They're in. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to the link below in the description box below, and you'll find a link to the notes. If you're taking this for credit, you'll find a link in the course for the notes, and you should have already been following this. The best way to do the notes is if you're on a computer or even your phone or mobile device, click the link. It opens up the internet. It brings the file up, and then you can set a bookmark on your web browser. You can do it on a phone. You can do it on a computer of any kind. And that way you can easily just go click the bookmark link and go right to it. So that's one way to do this. So you can easily find the notes, because sometimes I go through and update the notes. So it's a Google document. All my notes are in Google Docs, and it's a way in which I can update the versions of the notes as I go forward. Sometimes I'll find typos. Sometimes, maybe in the previous video, you may have heard me typing. I was actually correcting some things as I was giving the previous lecture and recording the previous video. So sometimes I may find little things like that, and I just want to take care of that right there on the spot. So, and then sometimes I may go in and add something and for later, and eventually maybe update the videos or something. But anyway, that's the way to get access to all the current versions of the documents moving forward, of all the courses in the MABE program, and as I update and continue to develop in these courses. So Acts 25 verses 1 to 7. It's really Acts 25 verse 1 to 12, but let me set the historical context for you. So Porcius Festus, he's now the new governor of the area of Judea. So he's different than Felix. He's a member of the Roman nobility. So we don't know much about him. He was brought in because Felix had to go, and so they needed somebody to take this over and run the office. So not much is known about him, but he died actually about 2 years after taking the office. So that's why, I mean, those 2 years is the only reason he was there for 2 years, because he dies after it's over. And he appears to have been an able leader. From a Roman perspective, he did his job. He was not a procrastinator. We know that for sure. He would move swiftly to acquaint himself with whatever situation. You have to realize that these Roman procurators and leaders, just say Roman governors, these governors would come in and they would last for so long. And the biggest thing they had to do was kind of come in and size up any situations that were taking place. They had a job to do that was keep the peace. They were like the police force. They were like the ones who would oversee all the Roman guards and the Roman soldiers, who had to make sure that everybody behaved themselves. And so some of these individuals had, visions of grandeur and thought they could make a name for themselves, just like politicians do today. Some were just pragmatic people. They just wanted to get the job done, go home and enjoy life, so to speak. And again, these Romans, most likely this guy came from Rome. If you're part of the nobility, you're not from Judea, okay? So he's sent there. He probably doesn't want to be there, but he has to go there. He's required to go there. And, maybe going there, he thinks, okay, maybe help me get me out of here and something better down the road. And I can have a better position somewhere else, somewhere more pleasing. I'm going to the desert. Oh, my goodness. I'm going to have to rule over the Jews, and nobody wanted to do that. And so here's Festus. And so he comes in and he's swiftly acquainting himself with the situation. So he arrived in Caesarea first, and 3 days after Festus arrived there in Caesarea to take over his new responsibilities, the text tells us he left for Jerusalem. And while he's in Jerusalem, that's the leading priests and the other Jewish leaders. They met with him, and they made their accusations against Paul. So they figured, okay, here's a new guy on the block, a new Roman governor, and we got to tell the whole story again. So instead of them coming to Caesarea and making that 26-mile-long journey like they did before with Felix, they decided, since Festus was in town, let's talk to him while he is there. And so he may have known about this when he got to Caesarea. He hears about Paul. He sizes up the situation. So while he's in Jerusalem, he's talking to these Jewish leaders. They meet with him. And, what's up with the Apostle Paul? What problem do you have? So here we go again. They are going to have to make their accusations. They're going to have to state them. We don't know if they used the same lawyer. We don't know how they communicated that. That's not the important thing. Basically, they're going to say the same thing. Sectarian, he's seditious, and and he's sacrilegious, all those same accusation as before. That's what they're going to do. But instead of doing it in the presence of the Apostle Paul in more of an official capacity, the way this worked out was when Festus went down there to Jerusalem, he, decides, let's meet, let's talk, let's have a powwow, let's discuss what's going on and what's the problem here. So his goal was most likely to conciliate the religious leaders as much as possible. The word conciliate means to try to appease them as much as possible. Again, Festus is not wanting an uproar. He's wanting everybody to be peaceful with each other. And he hears that, okay, I got this Apostle Paul guy in my prison. I'm inheriting him from Felix, and how much he already knows, and most likely it wouldn't surprise me if Festus even had conversations with Paul already. I don't know that. The text doesn't tell us that. But he just wanted to try to keep the peace as much as possible. So he knew the religious leaders were the key to establishing peace in Judea. He knew that. He's a politically minded guy. If you're going, you're over the Jewish area, and so you got to have relationships. Just as Pilate had to have relationships with King Herod and the religious leaders, it's same, just 20-something years later, and so with different characters, but it's the same political stuff going on. And so he knew the religious leaders were the key to establishing peace in Judea, and maintaining peace was the highest priority of a Roman provincial governor. And he was a pragmatic man, not one who just desired greatness or power. He was very pragmatic, just wanted to get the job done. Most likely he's thinking, I could probably last here 2 or 3, 4, 5 years, and this would step me up to something better. So he goes down there to figure out what's going on. However, the religious leaders made Festus face a difficult challenge. They had proven useful at manipulating Roman governors who ruled over them, like Pilate, others, Felix to a point. They were hoping they could do the same thing with Festus. They had capitalized on Pilate's blunders by blackmailing him into executing Jesus. Even though they had failed to pressure Felix into executing Paul, they had forced him to keep the innocent Apostle Paul imprisoned and out of circulation. From their perspective, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, they okay, we didn't get him killed. They didn't cut off his head, but at least they kept him from walking around, from spreading his lies. Because they saw him as the ringleader, right? Even though God's got his people spreading the gospel in other places who the Sanhedrin would not even know about. And Paul staying in prison, they didn't realize that Paul staying in prison for those 2 years allowed him to give the gospel to Felix over a 2-year period. You see, God's got his original plan. God is still sovereign, and God was going to keep Paul safe from the Jews. Now you deal with Festus. He also wanted to avoid any kind of uprising or revolt among the Jewish people. And so you have to think about this. Here is Festus in a political situation already from day one. Now, they asked Festus as a favor. They were probably like, Festus, transfer Paul down here from Caesarea. He's been up there for 2 years. Bring him down here. Let's deal with him down here. They didn't want to travel up there anymore. They thought if we get a change of venue, this would go our way. Because, yes, Paul is out of circulation, but maybe with a new guy, Paul could convince him. This could go back on us. we need to end Paul's life. We need to find a way to end this whole deal. And so the best way to do it is maybe we can convince him, we can manipulate him, we can connive him to the point where he would transfer Paul down here to Jerusalem. And the whole reason was they were wanting to ambush him and kill him on the way. So they thought if they bring him down here, they're thinking likelihood that Paul would come down. There would be some way that we could get all these Jewish men, get an uprising going. We could get a mob up there, and they would attack and ambush along the way, and we get rid of the Apostle Paul. But Festus replied that Paul was at Caesarea, and he himself would be returning there soon. And so I'm not going to bring him down. No need to bring him down. And see, that's what you see there is, even though there's the political intrigue going on, it's God's way of protecting the Apostle Paul. So he said, those of you in authority, you can return with me if you like. If Paul has done anything wrong, you can make your accusations. We can have another formal party, formal thing that happened like what was happening about 2 years prior with Felix. Paul shows up. The religious leaders show up. There's a formal inquiry, the whole shebang, the whole thing. Let's replay the whole thing all over again. And so that's what Festus tells the religious leaders. He's not buying it. And so he's not buying their agenda. He's not going to be manipulated. And so about 8 or 10 days later, Festus returned to Caesarea. But the religious leaders didn't go with him. They didn't go with him. And on the following day, he took his seat in court and ordered that Paul be brought in. Then when Paul arrived, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem, they gathered around and made many serious accusations they couldn't prove. So, at first I don't think they wanted to go, but they wind up going. So Festus returns to Caesarea, and they do show up. And so, and when Paul arrives, comes in, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem, they gather around, they make the many serious accusations so that they couldn't prove again. The religious leaders, they focused on Paul like wolves attacking a sheep. But these wolves were toothless. The many serious charges they brought were the same ones. We didn't have to rehearse this again, but it was the same ones. And so they talk about sedition and sectarianism and sacrilege. And so you go back to Acts 24, verse 5 and 6, the same three things that they had been unable to prove 2 years earlier before Felix. Those unsubstantiated charges were no more likely to convince Festus than they had Felix, but they gave it a go. So on the one hand, they wanted to convince Festus while he was in Jerusalem to bring Paul there. They didn't want to go back up with him. He waits about 8 to 10 days later. It says Festus returns to Caesarea, and most likely they came a few days after that. I don't think they went back with him initially, but then they went up there, and look what happens. Paul arrives, and here we go again. And so they're bringing up the same charges. And it's like they had no proof. Again, you can see how their anger was instilled in their life, these religious leaders, to the point where they hated Paul so much that they cared nothing for him. They wanted him gone, and they were thinking this is the timing, because now with a new person, new governor, he could be released, and we don't want him released. So what happened in the speech? Now this speech is not as long, because this speech sets up the next event, which is the longer event. But in Acts chapter 25, verse 7, latter part of verse 7 to verse 11, Paul denies the charges. He says, I am not guilty of any crime against the Jewish laws. That would be the sectarianism, or the temple. That would be the sacrilege, or the Roman government. That would be the sedition. So the same three items the same three accusations that were made back in chapter 24 are happening again, and Paul's denying them again, all in one statement. That's what he said. I'm not guilty. So he thus denied the charges against him point by point. And that could be a little bit more elaboration on that. We just don't have a record of it, but you get the idea. The idea is, I'm not guilty of any of this, Festus. But Festus is, so the text says, then Festus, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there? Are you? Are you willing to go to Jerusalem, stand trial? So Festus found himself in the same situation as Felix. Since Paul was a Roman citizen and falsely accused and obviously innocent, he was under pressure from his own convictions to release him. But to release Paul would antagonize the Jewish leaders, the same leaders Festus desperately needed to conciliate to keep the peace. And so Paul was, he's a Roman citizen, he's falsely accused, he's obviously innocent, and so he's same situation as Felix. Is he going to release him? Is he going to, or feel the pressure of being, of doing the thing that would, pragmatic thing that would help keep the peace, and that would be do nothing. Delay tactic once again. So he asked Paul, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there? But Paul replied, no, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I'm not guilty of harming the Jews. If I had done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I'm innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. Then he said, I appeal to Caesar. He's like, no, I'm not going down to Jerusalem. See, Festus is like, maybe I can just get, if Paul goes down to Jerusalem with them, they wanted him, right? They were requesting him to come down. Just go back with them. Let's get it done down there. Paul's like, no. Paul knows what will happen. He knows that he would be killed. And he says, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. And so Paul appeals to Caesar. What does that do? What does that do? He's not showing any defiance against Festus, but he's showing boldness before him. He's showing boldness before him because he's innocent of all the charges brought against him. He also knew that the sovereignty of God was working in this situation. He knew that God was going to get him to Rome. So God would have him go to Rome to stand before the Caesar, who is Nero. That was the Roman Caesar at that time in Roman history. So what's the response to all this? What happens? How does this speech end up? Well, chapter 25, verse 12. Festus conferred with his advisors and then replied, very well, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go. There's a lot in that statement. Festus was very willing to compromise with the Jewish leaders to keep the peace, but this would not work for Paul's betterment. They would just have him killed. So what Paul's doing is he's exercising his right as a Roman citizen, appealing his case directly to Caesar. Such appeals could come after the verdict, or the appellatio, the appeal, or as in Paul's case, before it, the provocatio. So you could it was a Roman citizen's right to appeal to Caesar, directly to Caesar. It was how Roman law was set up. And so you could do it after the verdict came down, which no verdict had come down yet, a verdict of innocent or guilty. Felix and now Festus is just trying to do delay tactics. They don't want to have to make a decision, and they just want this matter resolved. And so you could do it after the verdict or before the verdict. Before the verdict. In this case, it's before the verdict. So once granted, which Festus grants it. That's what verse 12 is saying. Once Festus grants it, the appeal removed the case from the governor's hands and it transferred it directly to the emperor. That means Paul is now going to have to go to Rome. And even though we might wonder why Paul would even make an appeal to Nero at this time in history, but you have to understand about Nero. Nero was not, even though he was the leader at the time, he was not marked by that cruelty and insanity that he would display just in a few more years. And God is sovereignly involved in this. So when Festus announced that his appeal had been granted, Paul knew that the Lord was definitely making a way for Paul to go to Rome to spread the gospel message. The spread of the gospel was the biggest focus of his life, not the political intrigues of the Jewish leaders or even the Roman statehood. He could care less about any of that. What drove him was preaching the gospel, was sharing the message of Christ. And you don't see a direct plea yet. The big speech that's coming up in Acts 26, where Paul is going to speak to King Agrippa, and Festus is going to be there to hear this as well. It's the big climactic kind of speech while he's still in Caesarea before he takes the trip to Rome. When he comes to make that speech, this is preparation for it, because by doing this, by saying, I appeal to Caesar and getting that granted, and Festus grants it, it's the way in which Paul is saying, Festus, you want to get this off your books? Send me to Caesar. I'm not going back to Jerusalem. So I'm going to get off of their books and I'm going to get off of your books. And it's going to be between me and now Nero. And from the human perspective of this, I am going to follow what God is saying. So he's not communicating that. He's not saying that yet. He's not telling them about how God has worked in his life. He hasn't described that yet. That is still coming in the next speech. But this speech, even though short, it brings to a conclusion all of the political drama of it all to a point, because now the Sanhedrin have no more say. They can't make any more accusations. And neither does Festus have to do anything about it. And so it's like off of his books. All that Festus has to do now, politically, is just prepare the documents to send with the Apostle Paul and those who take him, so that when he arrives in Rome, everything's good. They know exactly why he's there. But what you see here is Paul's intentionality. He's going to remain true to the gospel. He's going to remain true to who he is, what Christ has done in his life. He is officially, again, I'm not guilty of any crime. I'm standing true to who I am. I'm not a sectarianism or sectarianist. I'm not sacrilegious. I'm not a seditionist. I'm not against the Jewish laws or the temple or the Roman government in any way. I deny all these charges at every point by point. These people have no basis or no credibility for their attacks against me, their accusations against me. And you know what, Festus, I know you're not going to pronounce me innocent. I know Felix was not willing to pronounce me innocent. And I know because God, and he's not really saying this, but this is what he's thinking. God has decided that I will go to Rome, and it's not and you know what? That's God's decision. That's how God makes it. And it says, what Paul is saying is, I know that what is happening right here, right now, in my life is because of God, because of his plan, because of his direction, because of his leading, because of his desire. It's not because of me. And Paul was firmly fixed on that everything he would say, that it would be truthful, that it would be transparent, and that it would glorify the Lord. in everything that he would say and everything that he would do, because his modus operandi was to tell the gospel to whoever God would put in front of him. And this speech that he gives, even though brief as it is, sets up the next scene because of something that takes place. There is an arrival. Someone comes to greet Festus because of his new appointment, and it sets up the scene where Festus and King Agrippa, who is a descendant of Herod, from the gospel accounts, that both of these men are in their official capacities, and there's no more Jewish Sanhedrin making any accusations, but Paul is going to give one of the most powerful speeches of the gospel that you would ever hear, because he seeks to persuade the people in the room that their only salvation is in Christ and him alone. It sets up the next scene. So Paul is going to stay in Caesarea. He's not going back to Jerusalem. And when you take a look at all these speeches and you put them all together, you have to understand Paul is intentional about what he's doing and with what he is saying. And he will always be. Let's pray. Dear God, we do thank you again for this opportunity to study your word, to look at the life of the Apostle Paul, to see how he lived and how he spoke, and that he was guided by you in all things. That he could see your sovereign hand leading and directing, even though the world around him, the religious leaders, the Roman officials, and everyone else had no clue what was going on. But you were directing all things. And your will is going to be accomplished. Lord, you are the Lord of the universe, the sovereign one of heaven. And Lord, I pray that we would see the seriousness of proclaiming your word. That this needs to mean something. When we speak your word, our desire is that people know that we believe it fully. That we know it's real. That we know it's true because you have spoken it. And allowed us the ability to explain it. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would continue to work and lead and guide us. And may you receive all the praise and all the glory. In Jesus' name, amen. So we got 2 more to go. And the next speech starts in chapter 25, or the full context of this. Chapter 25, verse 13 to chapter 26, verse 32. And so it's a lengthier one. It may even take me 2 videos to make all of this. And so, and then we have the final speech in Acts 28. That's when Paul is in Rome. So we'll see how this goes. And but the next speech is really going to be the big one. It seems as though all the speeches are getting to this one, okay? The one about that's upcoming. If you really want to hear Paul present the gospel, this is where he does it. And so you don't want to isolate one speech from the other, but you want to see that this is what's happening and what's taking place. And so I'm looking forward to the next one, that's for sure. And we'll see how it goes. Anyway, May the Lord richly bless you, and we'll see you next time.